Hello everyone, this is Professor Troy Rondinone in the History Department, and as part of the series that we are doing with social justice and Black Lives Matter, I'd like to give a short lecture about race and incarceration in America. Just to begin with, I'd like to start with a simple question. Why do we imprison so many more people than all of our allies, and more specifically, why are African Americans so egregiously overrepresented? And to answer this question, I'm going to be using the tools of history, and hopefully I can shed some light. So let's begin. First of all, you can see by this graph that we incarcerate more people in the United States by far than any of our allies, and as a matter of fact, more than any other country in the world. And if you look at the data, it breaks down frighteningly along racial lines. This is a chart showing U.S. residents born in 2001, likelihood of imprisonment. You can see here 1 in 9 men, but if you break it down by race, 1 in 3 African American men are incarcerated. And Connecticut is no different than the rest of America. Here, data from 2010 shows that African Americans are egregiously overrepresented in the Connecticut prison system. So the question is, why is this? I will be arguing that this is due to racist laws, policies, and ideas in America. And then I will focus in more closely on a single episode, 1971's Attica Prison Uprising, to show how we can use history to understand this discrepancy. Actually, before I go to that, I guess I should define what a racist policy is. I'm going to use Ibram Kendi's argument. A racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial iniquity among racial groups. And as is very clear by this data, our justice system is racially biased. Okay, so I'm going to begin with kind of a discussion of historical legacies and before I get into the 1971 Attica Uprising. The modern incarceration discrepancy system begins with the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, which was designed to end slavery in America after the Civil War. Here's the text. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The loophole in this, as you can see, is except as punishment for a crime, meaning if a person is convicted of a crime, then then slavery can actually be applied. Now, this idea, enslaving somebody who has been punished for a crime, was not created by the 13th Amendment. It goes back to English common law and was existent in America from colonial days. However, placing it into the 13th Amendment would be used by southern states as a means of re-enslaving African Americans after the Civil War. So basically, briefly, after the American Civil War, African Americans were technically free thanks to the 13th Amendment. However, the Southern economy was completely decimated, and the Southern society was in ruins. And so white Southern lawmakers reconstituted their society and more specifically developed the South economically by systematically imprisoning African American men. This was compounded by what are known as the Black Codes. These are Southern laws that place curfews, required African Americans to carry passes, imposed vagrancy laws, meaning if you are African American and cannot demonstrate employment, that you can be force hired to local white planters. This also involves disenfranchisement, prevention from being on juries, prevention from testifying in court against whites, the banning of interracial marriage, and special taxes placed on African Americans who are not working in farm work or domestic occupations. In other words, an entire legal framework was created specifically designed to enforce racial hierarchy in the South. And in the South is where well over 90% of African Americans lived after the Civil War. And a key aspect of this was the convict lease system. And this is a system by which African Americans arrested for any number of things, including not listed, meaning the courts didn't even write down the reason for the arrest. African Americans could be leased out to local businesses. This means working on railroads, working in mines, iron factories, cotton factories, logging, turpentine production. In other words, all the elements that would modernize and industrialize the South. This was carried out via forced labor using convicts, specifically African American convicts. Now I'm going to fast forward a little bit. So what happened was the convict lease system existed roughly until the 1920s, and it was replaced by chain gangs and things like that. But by this point, African Americans were already wildly overrepresented in prisons thanks to these laws. And social scientists, however, looked at the prison landscape and determined that the reason that African Americans were being imprisoned was not due to laws, but rather due to something inherent in the race. So this is an example of how racist laws can beget racist social science, which will then be used to enforce more racist laws. During the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, there was a rise in protests, specifically in African American communities. I should say something about that too. African American communities in urban areas were also the product of racist laws, meaning white codes prevented whites from selling property in suburbs, for example, to African American buyers. A process known as redlining would be used to prevent African Americans from getting good loans and insurance and things like that. School systems based on property taxes meant that impoverished, segregated African American neighborhoods had less educational opportunities and funding. And so all of these forces compounded. And in the civil rights movement, there was a huge wave of protest. And the federal government responded not by looking hard at the police and the system of imprisonment, but rather by psychologically arguing that there was something deficient in African American communities. And furthermore, they thought that the answer was more imprisonment and more surveillance and more control. Just to give you a small example of this, 1965, this is in Southern California, the community of Watts. There is a uprising in response to police brutality, and the response is an overwhelming use of force by the federal government, followed by new laws such as the deployment of helicopters to surveil African American communities. Which brings me to the Attica Uprising. I just want to use this as an example of how African Americans responded to incarceration, and in turn how a rebellion against that incarceration would be used as an excuse for yet more and more brutal incarceration. So a little bit of background. Attica is a prison in upstate New York. In 1971, the prisoners in Attica staged a rebellion and took over the prison for 4 days. Now, the context of this uprising was the horrendous conditions endured by the prisoners. For example, the state provided every prisoner with a thin coat, 2 shirts, 3 thin pairs of pants, 1 pair of shoes. 3 pairs of underwear, 6 pairs of socks, and 1 comb. Once a month, they got a bar of soap, and once a month, they got 1 roll of toilet paper. They were allowed 1 shower per week. What this meant was, in order to take care of themselves in prison, they needed to work in the prison. Payment for a prison job came down to about 6 cents a day on the average, and even this was racially biased. White prisoners were paid more for the same work, and white prisoners got preferential treatment in terms of the jobs. In addition to all of this, the cells were poorly heated, so they would regularly get below freezing in the winter. Mail was censored, books were rare. Solitary confinement was the rule for anybody who talked back or disagreed with this. Medical treatment was very poor. There were no dentists. And it was so bad that prisoners were asked to volunteer to be test subjects for medical tests from nearby hospitals. And they volunteered for these things because they wanted supplies, such as toilet paper and soap. So in 1971, September 1971, a group of prisoners rebelled against the guards. The background was the guards' abuse of prisoners, and a group of prisoners found themselves trapped in a tunnel one day, being sent back to their cells, and this sparked a rebellion. Very quickly, about 1,300 prisoners had control over one of the yards, D yards. These prisoners, the racial breakdown was about 2/3 were African American, 1/4 white, and the rest Latinx. The prisoners quickly formed themselves into a political organization in the yard, led by members of the Black Panther Party, Weather Underground, and Young Lords. Prisoners set up medical stations, security services, food distribution. They created tents for shelter. They translated their documents into Spanish, and they actually elected representatives to vote on key decisions. TV cameras were invited in, and the prisoners got a hearing. As one of the leaders said, a prisoner named L.D. Barkley, who would later be killed in the raid, quote, "We are men, we are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such. The entire prison populace, that means each and every one of us here, has set forth to change forever the ruthless brutalization and disregard for the lives of the prisoners here and throughout the United States. What has happened here is but the sound before the fury of those who are oppressed." And the prisoners made a list of demands. This included a minimum wage for prison work, allowing prisoners to be politically active, religious freedom, the end of censorship of newspapers and books, better rehabilitation programs, educating correctional officers, a better diet, modernization of inmate education, better health care. And among these are some of the demands. Another demand was relocation to a non-imperialist country. However, this demand they did not expect to be met. Anyway, the FBI investigated and saw this uprising as being led by radicals and communists. And the state quickly organized itself to decide how to take over the prison. The reason why the state didn't rush in immediately was because the prisoners had taken hostages of the correctional officers. And so the state found itself in a position where TV crews were there, and they did not want to appear to be too violent. However, there was a tremendous political pressure for the state to do something. Here we have prisoners negotiating with the New York Commissioner of Corrections in the bottom left. That's Commissioner Russell G. Oswald. And so the state police were invited by the governor to retake the prison. Interestingly, the National Guard was not asked to retake the prison. And this is probably because in 1970, the National Guard had fired into anti-war protesters at several universities and killed students. And so Their reputation wasn't good at the time, so they decided that the New York State Police would do it. The plan was to shut off the electricity, drop in tear gas from helicopters, and then men with guns and tear gas projectiles would take over. However, it was very poorly planned. There was no plan about when to open fire or when to stop, no procedure about what to do with surrendering prisoners. The guards had no radios. They wore heavy masks that made it nearly impossible to see through the tear gas. And there was no plan about a time schedule as to when they would go in and for how long. Guns were passed out to the troopers, but these guns were not recorded with serial numbers, so there was no way of knowing who had fired what gun. And in other words, there was no accountability. Also, the soldiers, the police officers, took off all identification before they went in, so it was unclear who was doing what. So immediately, helicopters started to drop the tear gas into the yard, broadcasting with a loudspeaker, quote, "Surrender peacefully, you will not be harmed." At the same time, the officers rushed into the yard and immediately opened fire upon everybody. 128 men are shot, 39 inmates, and 10 of the hostages are killed. Here's a photo of the aftermath. And here are the prisoners afterwards. They were forced to basically crawl through the mud. Now, in the aftermath, the state reported that the 10 hostages who were killed were all killed with knives by the inmates. However, it soon became clear that they had all been shot, in fact, by the state police, who were firing wildly into the yard. The governor was quoted as saying that the hostage deaths were cold-blooded killings by revolutionary militants, end quote. And President Nixon would tell his aides that Rockefeller, the governor, had handled it well. He even said, quote, "I think this can have a salutary effect on future prison riots, just like the Kent State had a hell of a salutary effect." That's when the National Guard fired on students. Quote, "They can talk all they want about force, but that is the purpose of force." Rockefeller told Nixon, quote, "The whole thing was led by the blacks." And Nixon agreed, saying it was important to be tough on, quote, "the Angela Davis crowd." Oh, here's a protest. Here's Rockefeller discussing the success retaking Attica with President Nixon. And here's Angela Davis. Angela Davis was and is a scholar, an academic, and a reformer. And Angela Davis believes that prisons are so hopelessly racially biased they should be abolished. And so Nixon saw the troops invading Attica as a blow against, quote, "the Angela Davis crowd." In the aftermath of Attica, no troopers were ever indicted. A series of protests took place in other prisons, including in Atlanta, Cleveland, Baltimore, Detroit, Massachusetts, West Virginia, at a women's facility, Illinois, Maine, New York City, and even one in Paris, France. Eventually, prisoners who were severely injured did receive restitution, and this was in the year 2000. And remember, this event took place in 1971. And in 2001, guards or the families of guards who were killed also received some restitution. And indeed, in the aftermath of the Attica Uprising, there were many new reforms. Most of the prisoner demands actually received legislative attention. There was better food, new rehabilitation, better visiting privileges, less censorship, more showers, better medical care, etc., etc. But the ending is not a happy ending. In fact, the big takeaway for society was that we needed to be even tougher in our prisons. We see the rise of maximum security facilities, dramatic increase in spending on police forces, the increasing militarization of police forces. As a state senator said at the time, As a result of Attica, the public attitude is that we've got to get tougher. That means we've got to put more people in prison. We have not reached the point where as many people as should be in prison are there. So starting in about 1973, we see the rise of mandatory minimum sentences, such as 15 years for 4 ounces of narcotics in New York. A law is passed in Michigan for an automatic life sentence for about a pound of cocaine. This law and others would be repeated by other states. And here we see the rise dramatically of the rate and number of people incarcerated in prisons. And important to note, this is not a Republican or a Democrat program. This is bipartisan. That is, both major political parties find it politically expedient to, quote, get tough on crime. Of course, the biggest boom, as you can see in here, is in the 1980s. And this is thanks to Ronald Reagan's war on drugs, which is in fact essentially a war on African American communities, leading to a, as you can see, a dramatic boom in the prison population. But under Democratic administration in the 90s, we see a bipartisan crime control law, which gave another roughly $10 billion for new prisons. 1996, again under a Democratic administration, the Prison Litigation Reform Act makes it much harder for prisoners to legally protect themselves against the Eighth Amendment proviso of prevention of cruel and unusual punishments. I'll show you one more graph and then I'm done. This is state expenditures on corrections. And as you can see here, we spend more and more and more money into the billions on prisons and the prison system. So as Attica demonstrates, this is part of a chain, a long history of laws, policies, and ideas that are racist. And I say this, I say racist not as a word to lightly throw around, but rather as a description of a system that produces egregious, racially biased results. Thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you all when I can.